Welcome back to the classroom series here at Worth the Effort Woodworking. Today we're in the fourth section of our third chapter, which is all about saws. And in this fourth section, we are talking mainly about saw maintenance. Now, if you remember, in the first section of this chapter, all we talked about was how cool the design was of these saws. How much thought actually went into each and every part of it. How this is probably the smartest tool we have in our woodworking arsenal, and the only reason it would ever screw up is if we forced it to screw up. I mean, the design, everything from the hang angle of the handle to the rake of the teeth are all integrated. The thickness of the plate varies from saw to saw, and there's a reason why for it. There's a reason why you have all these lengths of saw plates, as well as the different weights of the back. I mean, as for such a simple item, the thought that went into it is just incredible. In the second section, it was mainly how to use a saw, the body mechanics, how to focus everything so that we could get out of its way so it will work effectively. The third chapter, we went into a lot of sawing techniques, how to get straight cuts, how to balance everything out to make things plumb, how to use the joinery saws versus panel saws and hand saws, dovetail saws, all that kind of stuff. We went into a lot of actual sawing techniques. And to wrap it all up, this chapter we're talking about maintenance, so that these things will last several generations and you can get the optimal performance of it. I'm going to be breaking this section down into basically talking about how to maintain the plate, working with the teeth, both refreshing and sharpening, and there is a difference there, and we'll talk about that, and modifying handles. So, let's start out with the part that will reflect your best work. Now, I think I'm somewhat on record as to not really liking vintage saws. Not because they weren't better designed, because 99% of them are better than what we have nowadays. You really have to step up in price level to get the quality that they were making back in the old days. But the older saws they're old. And I utilize the shiny plate of a saw so much in my woodworking as a check in quality and accuracy that most of the time when you find an old saw, it's so pitted and blackened and stuff like that, it's hard to see the actual reflection. The reason why I picked this particular saw with the guy I got it from was he said that the reflection was pretty good in it. But even compared to just a normal back saw, it's muddled. So one of the first things I do to maintain my saws is I will occasionally polish the plates just to get that shine out there and really protect them. Now, I know this is one of those tips that borders on common sense, but you would be surprised at how few people take just a few minutes out of their time. You got an old saw, just a little metal polish on it will change it so much. Now, I'm only going to do half this plate so that you can see the difference. So a quick little metal polish, wipe it off, and that made a little bit of a change. But this is only about 30 seconds worth of work so far. That is about all I ever have to do on my new saws, and I might do that once every other year. It's not that common. But for an old saw like this, once I do that initial polishing, which is going to get all that little surface kind of roughness off of it, I will grab a little sandpaper and just kind of go over it, and just kind of works off that last little bit of any kind of roughness that might come from whatever caused the little splotches. Spray it down with alcohol and see the results. So from here to here, can you see the difference? But more importantly, when I put it on its side, look at the reflection of the wood in the saw plate versus the back. It's crisper, it's easier to see detail, and that's the kind of stuff that I use whenever I'm sawing, because I can use a saw plate to determine my 90 degrees or my 45 degrees. A nice shiny saw plate is a real asset. Now once you've done that heavy cleaning, you basically stripped off all protection off of this metal. I mean, it is raw metal right now. So I do suggest you coat it with some kind of oil. I use jojoba, or however you say that, from Lee Nielsen. I bought this bottle forever ago, and it doesn't take much. But this is one of the few instances where I will really give it a good soaking and let it sit, if not for a few hours, then overnight. Just really work it in, and hopefully it'll get into all those pores and just maintain the quality that you've established so far. Now, if you are leaving your equipment for a long period of time, and you know you are, putting this thick coat of oil on before you pack it up or just leave it in your toolbox will prevent it from deteriorating much in your long absence. So having some kind of penetrating oil is a very good thing for your tools. Now, I use my saws a lot, and part of the normal use of working with them is I'm constantly putting wax on them. It just makes the cuts a lot easier. But this is little canning wax, and it doesn't really soak in, and it doesn't last that long. So for a little bit of extra protection, about once a season, I will grab some really hard paste wax, something with a lot of carnauba in it, and really give it a good polishing. And not only will that allow it to work better in the cuts, but it seems to, I know you can't really soak into metal, but that's kind of the end result, is they don't tend to gather as much dust, and what little dust they do gather, you know, dust soaks up moisture, and that piece of dust sitting on your saw plate will absorb the humidity of the air, and it'll make little rust spots. Can you see that little spot right there? That's probably just a piece of dust that was sitting on the plate while it was hanging up for a few weeks, and it rusted a little bit. So if you can keep your saw plates clean and with a nice coating of wax as a kind of a film finish, not only will they shine better in use, they will run slicker through the wood, but they just don't rust as much. And I found that just this once a season application of some kind of hard wax really does help that out. So maintaining the saw plate isn't just a cosmetic thing. There is a performance aspect to it. And once rust starts on it, yes, you can get rid of the rust, but the blackening of the plate affects its reflective nature, and it can't reflect your best work. You really do want to see what's happening within that reflection. And a nice shiny plate just does that. Plus the fact that occasional maintenance with hard waxes and stuff like that will make you a really slick edge. It just works a lot better as a saw. So let's progress from the actual saw plate to the saw teeth. Now I'm going to go out on a limb here, and in saying that for 99% of us modern day woodworkers, I don't think you should sharpen your joinery saws. I'm going to show you how to sharpen them in a second, but I don't believe it's really a skill you need to develop or perfect or even practice that often. But I'm going to qualify that. There is a major difference between sharpening a saw and just refreshing an edge. You see, sharpening saw means that you've got to understand the exact pitch, rake, the gullet size, the fleam, all that kind of stuff, and you have to get it consistent on every single tooth. I have a 20 teeth per inch, 8-inch saw right here, so I have to get it exactly the same for, what is that, 8 times, 160 teeth. If it's off any little bit, it could affect the cut. And really, if you think about how much most modern day woodworkers, and I'm not even talking about the weekend warriors, I mean professional guys, they are not using their joinery saws as much as they were even 100 years ago. I mean, for most of us, our hand tool work is a complement to the production work we're doing with machineries to get the bulk of it done. And these are some of the last tools to touch it. And that's their they need to be so precise for that reason. Now, back in the old days, one of the first jobs any apprentice had was sharpening the saws in the shop. And if you were on a construction site, you were pretty much doing that from dusk to dawn, because you had 12 guys out there, and all they were doing was with their crosscut saws cutting up 2x4s. So they would sharpen their saws, once every few days, especially if they had an apprentice doing it there for them. And that apprentice just developed a feel over the weeks of doing them all day long, and that feel translated to a really great cutting saws. But how many 2x4s do you cut with a handsaw? Really, for most people, you buy a saw, that saw might stay sharp for most of your lifetime. Most production woodworkers I know nowadays, they probably get their saws sharpened maybe every 4 or 5 years. And the guys I know, they send them off to specialists. Somebody like, there's 1 or 2 people at Lee Nielsen that sharpen all the saws that come out of that company. And that if you ever buy a Lee Nielsen, one of the advantages of doing that one is you can put it back in the box and send it back to them, and they will resharpen it for an incredibly low fee. I mean, it probably less than maybe 15 minutes you would pay your mechanic at an auto dealership. They will give you the perfect edge, reset, just do everything perfectly. It's the bargain of the century, and there are a lot of guys out there that would do that. I know Bad Axe has a whole sharpening division. You can send them pretty much any saw and they will resharpen it. And that's one of the kind of fallacies out there, that you have to have a great and wonderful expensive saw to cut well. No, you just have to have it sharpened well. Even a cheap little $12 crown will cut brilliantly if it has a great sharpening. And most of us just don't do it enough to get good at it. And that includes me. But I'm going to show you the techniques to do it if you want to try it. Now, on my hand saws, where the bigger pitches and stuff like that, yeah, I will sharpen mine, because those tend to dull a little bit quicker for me. I can't explain why, than my joinery saws. These right here, I will refresh in maybe once a year, if that much. And that's the main process I think most of us can grasp fairly easily. Now, here are my 2 most commonly used saws, and I think I've explained this in the first section of this chapter. I have my carcass saw. It's filed crosscut. I'm using it at the workbench all day long to cut joinery. And then I have my dovetail saw. And yes, I do prefer a gent, but that is a personal preference. There's no real difference in the function of the teeth. And this is filed rip. And you notice these are very, very tiny teeth. So I'm not going to sharpen them, but I am going to bring them back to their factory freshness by basically refreshing the edge. And that's all I do. To do that one, I like using a jig, simply because I don't do this very often. And I use this here Veritas jig. And what it allows me to do is it will hold a triangle file in this setting, and it has this little gauge on the side so that I can rotate it, so not only will this side piece be horizontal to the teeth, but I can also change its angle. And to explain why we do that one, let's go to the board so I can explain teeth to you. Okay, so in order to explain this refreshing and sharpening, I gotta go over a few terms. And just me explaining these terms will kind of solidify why I feel sending the true sharpening off to experts is a smart decision for most of us. Now, all of these terms are interactive, meaning if you affect one, the others will change and you have to adjust them. So there really is, I don't want to call it an art form, but there's a finesse to it to get the best results. And this is also going to explain to you why in the old days, a craftsman would have 30 saws. Each saw was tuned to a specific species, a specific thickness of wood, whether it was a green wood, a dry wood, or somewhat in between. Because these saws would specialize to get the best results with the least muscle having to be worked and the least tear out and damage to the wood. I mean, it can get really complex. But nowadays we have power tools that affect most of those other kinds of saws, so having a smaller set, even 2 or 3 saws like the ones I mainly use, works out for most of us. So let's start out with, we basically have a tooth. And let's assume that the cutting direction is this way. So we would be pushing the teeth that way. Now, I have a baseline. That baseline is generally called the gullet, the bottom of the tooth. And then you have the TPIs, how many points you can count over a certain amount of time. And that's generally referred to as a pitch. PPI, TPI, it generally comes out to the same thing. The higher the number, the more teeth per inch. Generally you're doing finer work, more accurate work. The lower the number, the more rough work you're doing. Even a bucking saw might have 2 teeth per inch, but that's a 2-man saw cutting logs in half. The other big term we're going to be talking about is rake. And that's how much the cutting edge is set back from 90 degrees. If you draw an imaginary line going straight up, how much it leans back is the rake. Now, for the most part, rip saws don't have that much rake, or not in comparison to crosscut saws. A very aggressive rip saw might even have a negative rake, where it leans forward a little bit, so it will really dig in. Generally, when you're talking rip saws, the more it leans back, the little bit less work it's going to be doing, and the little bit easier it's going to be to start. But that is only if it is balanced with the hang of the handle. And if you remember that in that first section where we talked about the design of tools, the hang position of the handle affects how the tooth line is working. Man, these things are really well designed when they work right. So, for the most part, rip saws are going to be fairly upright. Where crosscut saws, because of how they are doing more of a slicing action, they tend to be leaned back. And that comes down to how a blade going straight across or skewing it to an angle will lower the effective angle. That's what we're talking about there by leaning it back a little bit. Then you have fleam. That's basically the bevel of the tooth. Now, most rip saws are not going to have any fleam at all, or maybe up to about 5 degrees for certain wood species. Yeah, it gets complicated. Whereas a crosscut tooth, you'll be able to see the bevel when you look at the side of the plate on every other tooth. So it might come down like that. And those angles themselves can vary. A lot of times it's common to see, plus or minus 15 degrees, but it varies depending on what you're trying to do. Then you have the slope. And that's actually something we don't talk that much about it. And personally, I haven't found any evidence it does much. And it'll be a lot more easier for me to explain slope in a second when we're talking about the triangle files we use to sharpen. But slope is basically how far down below the gullet line, the baseline, that you bring that bevel. Because there's a thought that if you bring it down a little bit lower, the tooth line doesn't lose any strength, but you get a little bit more space for sawdust to come out, and it will kind of push the sawdust to the side of the plate and make it easier to fall out. It might just be hypothetical theory. Finally, you have the set, and that's how much you bend each tooth to the side of the saw plate. And the set will, if you increase the set, bend it more, it'll create a bigger curve. And that does have some positive benefits. If you have a bigger curve, as the wood contracts, it won't bind up on the saw plate. So if you're cutting green wood, having a huge set is ideal. But if you're cutting really dry wood where the wood's not going to be moving very much, you can reduce the set so that you're not removing as much wood. You can actually cut that kind of wood a little bit faster and create a smaller cut. But in reality, I find having a little bit of extra set allows me to steer the saw plate a little bit when I'm first starting out. Because if you have no set whatsoever, that first push of the saw plate is going to establish the cut line all the way down. If you're off 1/4 of a degree, the farther down you go, the farther away from the saw line you are. But if you have a little bit of a set, a little bit of a curve, that saw plate can kind of wiggle its way down, so you can kind of steer it, and once you get, maybe 1/10 of the way down your cut, you will establish that straight line. It'll cut straight from there on. So a little bit of set in my mind is a good thing, even though it seems the fashion that people want to have as little set as possible nowadays. Yes, you can even tune these teeth to your own preferences for usage. Now, when we sharpen or refresh a saw, we are generally using, at least in the European style American saws. The Japanese saws, it's an entirely different animal. So yeah, that's a lot more complex than what we do. But we will use a 60-degree file. Basically, it's an equilateral triangle where each angle is 60 degrees. It makes all our geometry that we use in our style saws work. And when you're picking out a saw, you generally want to find a file where the tooth goes up to less than halfway. That way you can use each edge of the file. If the tooth goes up more than that, basically you can only use that file for one sharpening or, a few sharpenings. You can get a lot more life out of it if you get the proper sized file. So, when you're holding that triangle, that 60-degree tooth line fits in right there. If you rotate your file, you can affect the rake of the tooth. So rotation handles the rake. The fleam handles with how much you angle that file in relation to the saw plate. So if I move the file left or right, that affects the fleam. And if I move it up and down, which is something most saw sharpeners tell you to never to do, that affects that slope we were talking about earlier. How far down below the gullet line it cuts. Now ask yourself, do you want to deal with all that math, all those variables? Do you want to do all the research to determine whether you want a 12-degree rake with a 13-degree fleam, because those two numbers will interact? Or do you want to send those over to people that actually have done the research, have done the time, have sharpened a few hundred or thousand saws, they've gotten a feel for everything? Yeah, me personally, I'm going to send it off. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to refresh it. And refreshing a blade is a lot simpler, because all you do is you follow what's already been established. Now, if you are going to get into sharpening or just refreshing your saws, you're going to have to get a few tools. And the big one is going to be some way to hold your work. Now, I've got right here a Gramercy saw vise, and I fell in love with these after I bought a few of those iron vintage ones, like Witherbees and stuff like that. I never had good luck with them. And I know some people will just use two boards that they clamp up in their vise to squeeze on the saw plate, and that works just fine for them. I've just found that having a good saw vise, a decent saw vise, makes the world of difference in the results you're going to get, because they pretty much eliminate the vibration, and the vibration is what kills your sharpening effort. This one right here, as I said, is a Gramercy one. Now, I want to say they came out with it maybe 10 years ago. What's so cool about it is they use steel plate instead of a lot of that iron, and it made a huge difference in the efficiency. Let me show you some of those features. Me personally, most people will mount these permanently in one spot. I just put it on a board that I can hang up, and I've got a little cutout right there that fits just perfectly on my leg vise, the wooden threads. So whenever I need to sharpen, it's just a matter of dropping it down in my leg vise, anchoring it down so it doesn't go anywhere, and tightening it up. This gets it to a height where I can actually sharpen, and I don't have to lean too far down to get it right at my eye line. But what makes this Gramercy so cool is I want you to notice the gap. Right now it is tightened up so it's even, but as you loosen it up, they've actually bent these steel plates so that they squeeze on the outside before they squeeze in on the middle. And that gives you a lot of very even pressure all the way across. Where all the metal, the other iron ones I did, they kind of couldn't let the iron flex that much because it would break. And whenever you squeezed it, it would match up evenly all the way across, which meant that when I was working on this end or this end, it would vibrate way too much. And how these work is you basically just drop your saw right in there so that just the teeth are showing at the very top. And if you have a longer saw, you can basically slide it back and forth. And you do not want much of the teeth hanging above as you're doing this. The closer you can get that tooth line to with the squeezing action, the less vibration there will be at the tooth line as you're sharpening it. And it's the vibration that kills everything. The other tools you're going to want is obviously your files. Now let me go off for a little bit on files. I bought this kit from Lee Valley, and they give you a good selection, but the ones that are most valuable are what they call the needle files. And these are the ones you're going to end up using the most as a saw filer if you're just doing touch-ups like me, because what are the two most common saws I use? My dovetail and my carcass. And you can see the size of this file. It will drop into each one of these tooths, but it doesn't go more than halfway up. And these are the smallest files that they have out there. So you just can't get any smaller than this, and really their only purpose is saw filing. And because so few people actually do this kind of work, they just don't make them very much in this size. Another thing is finding a good manufacturer of files. Now I bought my set from Lee Valley, and Lee Valley sells, they do some research and they find good examples. So if you don't buy files but every few years, just trust the manufacturers that are doing good research. And occasionally they will go out of stock of this stuff. Not because they can't buy them, but maybe the manufacturer that they were working with got sold and they're no longer making the higher quality files out there. I do know that on these, the needle files were on back order for an extremely long time, and they eventually found some manufacturer in France that was doing some decent quality ones, and they bought a whole bunch so while they were doing good work. You can find these bigger size files fairly often, but once again, quality for the majority of them just sucks. If you find a good set, buy a bunch of them. These larger size ones are fairly inexpensive, so stock up while you can. The needle ones, you know, while these might be a couple bucks each, I want to say these are like 20 bucks each. And one file will sharpen your saws maybe a dozen times, so it'll last a while for most of us. The other thing is you want some kind of block to help you with your angles. A lot of people would just buy a wooden block and just kind of eyeball it, lock it in there, and it'll keep them consistent all the way across the tooth. I use this Veritas setup, and it's kind of self-explanatory, and I'll demonstrate that in a second. The other thing you're going to want is, I really like using a Sharpie because it'll darken the teeth, and whenever you get the shine back, you know you sharpened everything. And I hold on to my guides right here, and you can download these for whatever saws you buy from the manufacturer, and they will tell you what they had from the factory. Now I will say this, most manufacturers, Lee Nielsen, Lee Valley, all that kind of stuff, the angles they set on their teeth are kind of so that a beginning woodworker will have success very easily. And then after you work a while, whenever you send it off to that expert, tell them the kind of work you're doing. Tell them, hey, I work mainly in oak, 3/4 work, I do a lot of dovetailed boxes, or 3/8 in cherry. Or tell them what they will do, and give them the flexibility to reset all your angles, your teeth, your TPI, all that kind of stuff to work with where you are after you've been in the craft for a while. Stick with the factory settings while you're learning, and then when you know what you're going to be wanting to do in the future, let the experts sharpen them to your settings and ask them to give you those numbers. Because then I can now dial all those into my little device, go back into my saw, and just drop the file into each tooth, and it will settle kind of at the previous angles, and then just a stroke or two at those settings will refresh what I have here. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my file in this little jig. Just drop it in a little ways, far enough in that you can use this grub screw to anchor it down. So as you can see, it is now locked in and that angle is set so it will work with this gauge right here. So now I can come over, coming on this back side, line everything up the way I want. So my directions, my owner's manual, tell me that this is my dovetail is a rip saw. So it doesn't have any fleam, meaning bevel, but the angle, the rake, is set to 14 degrees. So if I set this to 14 degrees, and you notice it's set 0, 0, 30, that's because it'll be different between if you're going this way or that way. And then on the top it has an angle where I can set it to 0 so I have no bevel, no fleam. So hopefully you can see, I know it's kind of tight in the picture, but the triangle, when I'm holding this level right now, this side right here is just a little bit off of 90 degrees. So that is going to be my rake. This is going to be that interior angle. So that it's going to be, this would be the toe of my saw when I'm sharpening, kind of like that. So this is how I'm going to use it. Now before I sharpen, I will come through and I will darken every single tooth. And yes, you will end up destroying a Sharpie, but that is a cheap expense. Consider that disposable. Do this on both sides and then go back through and make sure you get all the interior parts of each tooth colored, because that will tell you what you've actually done, because it is very easy to get off of 1 or 2 tooth when you're doing this because they are so small. And then just kind of come back through. Make sure you color them all. Then put it in your saw vise and get to work. So I've got my saw in the vise, and as you can see there is not much of the teeth standing above it. My handle is on this side, and when you are sawing this you always want to sharpen or refreshen going towards the toe being the front, heel being the back, because it'll keep the pressure even going against the tooth. For some reason, body mechanics, it just doesn't work as well the other way. And these saw files, they have kind of a safety on end, so you want to make sure that you're going to use the full width. I will go ahead and go forward until I touch this. That way I'm just being consistent. And then it's just a matter of counting strokes and making sure you get it even all the way across. Now this saw is pretty sharp, and I'm just doing this for demonstration, so I'm just going to take 1 stroke per tooth, making sure I don't miss any teeth, and that's why it was so important to blacken it in. Also, make sure you're wearing glasses. You do not want any shavings to get into your eye, and absolutely positively do not touch your face at any time while you are sharpening until after you go wash your hands. These metal filings will do horrific damage to your eyes, the lenses. I mean, it will be months before it'll be repaired up. I mean, they will just scratch it horribly. Do not touch your face. So I'm going to come on the end. I'm going to make sure my angle is flat. That's at 0 degrees. So I'm not inducing any kind of bevel or flame. I come over, I start in the safe area of my triangle file in that first tooth, and then it's just a matter of keeping this flat, this little angle, and that'll make sure everything stays right. 1, and you will get in kind of a rhythm when you're doing this. Just don't skip any teeth. Now from this angle you can see the importance of that Sharpie. See how it tells you when you accidentally skip a tooth? Now this isn't very hard work, it's not very difficult work, but it does take quite a bit of focus. So make sure you've got about 5 minutes of time set aside where you know your significant other or your dog or nothing's going to bother you. I can't even listen to music while I'm doing this. I mean, every single tooth has to be hit. You cannot hit the same tooth twice. You do not want to skip a tooth. It's not pressing down hard, you're just letting the file do the work, but it's tedious, it's monotonous, it just has to be done right. Now if you do it right, what's kind of fun is when you take it off, if you put it on your hand, it grips your skin. That's how you can tell it's really, really sharp. Okay? So let's go try it out. Now some people will do what they call stoning, which means that they run it along their their diamond stones or water stones on one side, because if you feel it, you're going to feel a lot of burrs on both sides right now. I've just found that if I just use a dovetail saw for, a few dovetails, it might be coarse when I'm first starting, but those burrs tend to work off. And cuts pretty smoothly. Now you can only do a refreshing on a saw this size once or twice, but once again, for most of us, that's years in between servicings. And the reason why is because it's so fine, you eventually saw off all the set on either side, so that needs to be addressed. And then, we're not doing this all the time, so it will become uneven. These teeth are not perfectly punched anymore, even after just refreshing it once. You might have hit one tooth once or twice too often. Now you put a fraction of a pound-foot of pressure more on one tooth the other. For whatever reason, it just gets off. But it's a good way to kind of retouch up your teeth to extend the time you send it off to an expert. So now we're going to do the crosscut saw, which means that we're going to introduce the flame, the bevel on each tooth, which means we have to be incredibly important not to skip the tooth, because now we have to sharpen every other tooth, and we have to start going in the right angle, because basically we're introducing the flame. So you hit every other tooth one direction, then you flip the saw and you hit every other tooth the other direction. That way you can get the bevel on both sides. So looking at my owner's manual, it tells me the settings I need, which are basically 15 degrees rake, and it says 75 degrees flame, which that basically means 15 degrees, because 75 minus 90 is 15. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate the file to get a fresh edge. Then I will set the rake. Then I will set that flame. So 10, 15 degrees. So there we go. I now have the rake on this side, and in order to get the flame just right, I had to get it now that horizontal to the plate, parallel to the plate. And don't forget to darken those teeth. Now in my mind, the crosscut is so much more difficult than the rip, because if I skip a tooth on the rip, it's not that big a deal. I can actually go back and get it. The color change from the Sharpie will tell me. But if I skip one tooth when I'm doing a crosscut, well, that will get the bevels off. Because remember, every other tooth has bevels on that side, every other tooth has bevels on this side. And the set is set for each one. So because of that, what I would do is I will check every 5 strokes. So I'm going to sharpen one, You actually have to skip a tooth, sharpen the next, skip a tooth, sharpen the next, and then keep going. So I give myself 5 strokes, and then I check to make sure I'm on the right tooth. Because if I've screwed up between 5 strokes, you know, I've only screwed up a 1/2 inch of the blade. And this is also why all y'all that have been asking why I have this on my tool rack, this comes out. So it looks like I start on the first tooth here at this angle. So I'm going to get this parallel to the plate and flat, and that'll make sure everything is just right. Start in the flat, line everything up, and one smooth push. Skip a tooth, come back through. I don't know if you can see this, but what I typically do, because I'm so paranoid, is I sharpen a tooth, then when I come back, I kind of leave the triangle in there, and I count over. Click, click. That's 2 teeth. Put it back in the same tooth, click, click. Because you did that filing, that teeth that you're putting back into is going to be a little bit deeper, so it's easier to see. And I don't know why, but I always tend to do it, I change the angle, so I have to go back and check all the time. Once again, the crosscuts I find are the most difficult. And then check to make sure you're on the right track. You're not getting off. I believe I'm okay. Now, when you start going the other way, I change the angle of the flame, but I didn't change anything else, and I'll keep everything else consistent. All we're changing it. So now I've got to do every other tooth. Make sure you get started on the right tooth. Otherwise, you're just destroying all the work you've just done. Yeah, crosscuts I find a lot more difficult. So I'm going to come over, and I'm going to come over 2 teeth to start. Get everything lined up, then just give it a nice stroke through, pull back, and do 5 teeth, and make sure I'm on the right path. So then get going and don't stop. It'll take you about 5 minutes of intense concentration to get all the way down, but pauses will screw everything up. If you screw one tooth up, don't stress about it. You've got 200 and some odd more that'll compensate. Okay, let's try it out. I don't know what this would actually proves. Yeah, it cuts nice and straight. A little bit grabby until I get those burrs worked off. But yeah. Not using much weight, just the weight of the saw. About a 1/2 inch per stroke. That'll work. So yeah, what I just did is not hard to do, but understand, I was just going back over what was already established. Doing the same thing. Allowing the triangle file, the needle file, to drop into an existing triangle, and then just pushing forward. The big thing was counting and making sure I was on the right tooth. That is not sharpening. That is refreshing what was already sharpened. So decide for yourself if that's all you ever really need to do. Now let's get into sharpening. In my last video, I made these 2 panel saws. Panel saws are smaller than hand saws, and they're designed to go in a toolbox. And most of people were using them at a joinery bench, not on a like a hand saw, which is a lot longer. These were pre-stamped out at the geometry I wanted. The rake and the rake and yeah, just the rake and the TPI. I now have to go through, joint it, or breast it. Breasting sometimes on larger saws happens where they don't have it dead flat. They have it at a slight curve, and especially in grain woodworking saws. And you have to get that curve just dead perfect and dead even, gradual. I mean, it's not peaky or whatever, in order for the saw to work properly. Me, because these are panel saws mainly for rough joinery work, I am going to flatten it. I'm going to joint it dead flat, then set the teeth, meaning bending them from one side to the other, and then go through the sharpening process like I showed you before. So, real quickly, let's joint it and set the teeth. So I've got it in my saw vise. Notice this is quite a bit longer, so I'm going to have to actually, when I'm sharpening it, start on one end, sharpen halfway, then undo it, move it over, and sharpen the rest. You've got to have the teeth being squeezed in order to eliminate vibration. Vibration is the enemy of good sharpening. So I've got it raised up pretty high because I'm about to joint it. And jointing it is basically taking a mill file, flat mill file, and just running it along the teeth just enough so it touches every single tooth. So to determine that, we go back to blackening. Make sure you get every tooth. Don't want to skip one. Get it outside and inside. So I've just got a standard mill file, nothing special about it, though I do have it set up so I can use this little device. And it'll allow me to either set it at a 45 degree or 90 degree just by sliding it in here and tightening up my screws. Make sure it doesn't hit my vise, so I'll raise it up a little bit higher. You can hold it at 90 degrees if you want to, but this little jig just makes it easy. And I'm just going to take one stroke, making sure to keep it flat. And then come look at all the tops of the teeth. If I see a shiny spot on every single tooth, like that tooth right there, I just barely touched it, but the other tooth beside it, I got a good big shiny spot. So I'm coming along, making sure I hit every single tooth with that one. Missed that one right there, but if I only miss one, I'm going to be happy. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. Now, if you are going to be changing the geometry of the teeth for whatever reason, maybe adding fleam or adding a rake or turning a crosscut to a rip or a rip back to a crosscut, whatever you want to do, this is the time you'll do it, before you add in set. Now, a lot of times they'll already have a little bit of set in it, but you're going to be inducing more, and set kind of does affect the geometry a little bit. So it's easier to change a tooth shape before you add in more set. And now, my saws were kind of pre-punched the way I wanted them, so I don't need to do that one. I'm just going to go into setting it. Now, there are a lot of ways to inducing set. I mean, some people will advocate for taking a small hammer and just kind of tapping them all the way down. I don't know how they ever got consistency that way. For the most part, I think most modern day sharpeners, they use something called a saw set, which is basically, it's like a little bit of pliers, but it doesn't really grip anything. And pretty much everybody had something like this back before power tools became in vogue. And nowadays you'll find them in garage sales and nobody really knows what they are. But they're how you move the teeth over left or right. For the most part, you're going to find that saw sets come in pairs. One is dedicated for low teeth TPI saws, big panel saws and stuff like that. And the other for your finer dovetail saws. And the big difference between the two is the hammer. And the hammer is what they call, let's see if I can focus it in. Right here, as you squeeze through, there's a little piece of metal right there, and that's really, really hard. And as you squeeze it, it engages this portion and presses the tooth onto it. This is called the anvil. So you have a hammer and an anvil. And the anvil is actually rotatable, and it has different angles that you can induce to it. Probably better seeing it right here. As you can see, the angle kind of comes over. So the smaller you have it set, the hammer can't push it over as much. And the big one has a bigger hammer. Obviously on this one right here, if you were to use that on a dovetail saw, it'd probably move 3 teeth over at the same time. Hence the difference. That's really the only change. Now, how much set you want to induce is variable. It depends upon what you're wanting to accomplish with the saw. As I've said earlier, if you're doing green wood, which has a high tendency to kind of contract after you've sawn it, you want a lot of set. So you might angle those teeth out. But there is a certain point where you can't bend the steel anymore, otherwise it just breaks. Which is why a lot of those cross-cutting saws, like you see those 2 men do, they have these really long teeth, so that even a slight angle will give them a lot more set. Whereas if you're doing a joinery saw, you might want a little bit less set, because you don't want to remove as much material. It cuts faster, it cuts easier. Having a little bit does induce that steerability, which I talked about earlier. I think there's a general rule of thumb out there that on joinery saws, you don't want the set any more than half the thickness of the tooth, of the plate. So if you have a .032 plate, you really only want it to come out maybe half the distance on each side. And that should be good enough. But the key thing is you've got to have it consistent all the way down the plate. You have one erratic tooth going out, it will snag every single time and just destroy your edge, especially if you're sawing to split a line like we do when we're cutting dovetails or the shoulders of mortise and tenon joints. And that's kind of why I think these saw sets, the little plier-like devices, have become popular, because they are fairly consistent compared to just balancing how much pressure you hit a nail with a hammer. Now these saw sets on the anvil portion of it do have numbers, and I've heard so many discrepancies on what those numbers mean. Maybe if it's number 10, you're doing it for a saw that has 10 TPI. But then I've heard other people say that, hey, these are metric numbers and they make these for the worldwide market, so you can't go off of that in this country. I don't know. The best way I've done it is just simply trial and error. I know that these back few teeth right here, I don't really use very much in my typical push stroke. So I will test it out on these back teeth and set it so it's just taking maybe a full width of the tooth out a little bit more than I need, and then I'll show you in a second how to bring them all back consistently. So I'm going to rotate this anvil on this little diagonal slider to a point where I believe that the hammer will touch the anvil at a point where the angle will be just about the height of my tooth, or maybe a little bit less, and I'm just kind of guesstimating here. So with all those settings, you're going to drop the saw down in this gap and rest it on either wing. Though on this first tooth, you can't really rest it on a wing. And then it's just a light squeeze. Do not give it a hard push, because that's when it could crack. And just a little bit, and that's all you need to get the tooth to move over. And hopefully you can now somewhat tell that these 2 outer teeth are slightly more than this way. So I'm now going to come back on this side and do the same thing to the other 2 teeth, and we will just judge from there. That looks about right to me. So now that everything's locked in the way I like it, I can just drop it down and go down the line and bend over every other tooth. Then if you don't want to go to the other side, you can just flip the saw, then just go back and you'll end up bending all the teeth the other direction. Now hopefully you can see every other tooth goes on either side of the plate. So this saw is now set and they are fairly even. And a coarse cutting saw, this is good enough for me. But on the dovetail saw, one of the tricks I know of is if you have a metal vise, you can put a couple pieces of index card, wrap it around it, and then squeeze it in that metal vise. And what will happen is the teeth will actually pierce the paper and bend down, and it'll make the set pretty much the exact width of however much paper you put down on it. So that's how you, like on a dovetail saw, when you're setting them, you can get them very, very consistent. I'm not going to mess with that one because I'm kind of happy with this setup right here for this coarse rip cutting saw. Now I'm going to take a picture so hopefully you can see that each tooth now has a little shiny spot on it. This setup of what I've done of jointing and setting the teeth, reshaping them if I wanted to in between points, is exactly the same whether you're doing a crosscut or a rip. Only when you start sharpening it does it really change. And how much you sharpen it just depends upon that shiny spot on the top of each one of these teeth, because you're going to run your file until that shiny spot disappears, and that might be slightly different on each tooth because when you jointed it, it put them all at one level, but some teeth got removed more metal than the others. If you make it so that just that shiny spot disappears, every single tooth will be at the exact same height. Now I forgot what rake angle I ordered with this saw plate whenever they punched it out, because I ordered it 4 years ago. So here's another thing. Mainly you want it consistent, and I trust that when they punched it out they made it consistent. So what you can do is you can loosen up the rake angle adjustment on whatever device you have, and this is a rip saw. So if I just drop it into the tooth and get it settled down in there, I can then just drop the file into any random tooth and kind of get it settled in there, and then just make this adjustment that I keep parallel, flat, and horizontal to the ground. And as long as that stays consistent throughout everything, I'm going to be filing just fine. Oh, and it goes quicker if you put the file in the right way. On the bigger ones, put the handle in, not the little tip. Then when you reach your final portion on your vise, just move it down. Even a small vise can handle big saws. So after going all the way down, I'm going to say that 9 out of the 10 of them I've gotten rid of the flat spots, and that's going to be good enough for me for this time. I don't use this saw that much, and I can tell it's really sharp because just laying your hand on it, it's very prickly. I mean, when you feel a sharp saw, you're going to be able to tell. I mean, compared to even a sharp tooth saw straight from Home Depot, this is a lot pricklier. So, real quickly, let's try it out. Yeah, I know 1x4 isn't the most hard test, but it's what I got. So come on over, one backstroke back. Ooh, grabby. Yep. That's a fairly quick, coarse cut. Just what I wanted from this saw. Now after that test cut, I do think I want to stone the sides. It was a little bit grippier than I want. And all I ever do for that one is I lay it on the side of my bench. I have a diamond stone. It's roughly 1,000 grit. And I'm just going to make one pass with just light pressure on each side. And that should remove a tad bit of set and also deburr it. Good enough. Now to repeat the entire same process, except this time with my crosscut. And remember, the only variable with a crosscut will be adding the fling. And y'all don't need to see that again. So, let's start talking about handles. Now, a saw's handle is the most intimate part of the tool. I mean, it's akin to getting a good steering wheel or the proper angle on the motorcycle bars. The connection you have with everything that's going on with the saw happens through the handle. And lucky for us, they're wood, so we can modify them if we want to. So let's cover a few things about them. First off, the finish. Most of the ones you see sold out there nowadays are going to have some kind of shellac or lacquer finish on them, a film finish. And the first thing most of us are going to do is you got to strip that off, especially if you're going to be using the saw quite a bit. Because that film finish is just going to let the moisture in your hand just sit there, and you end up getting blisters and stuff like that. A slight oil wax finish, the wood will absorb a little bit of the sweat in your hands, and it'll get, it just feels better, and it just doesn't seem to wear as badly. Second thing, the shape. Now, what's cool is wood we can adjust. We are woodworkers, and the shape is so personal. There's a reason why they have so many different sizes. Look at this big old D8 right here. I slide my hand in here. See how big a gap there is between the two horns? What that means is I now have to hold this saw up. I have to grip it pretty hard. Where this handle right here, the stock one on the carcass, just fits my hand perfectly. Because if you notice, the bottom of my palm goes right in that bottom horn, and the one on top fits the top. I just grip it. There's no pressure right here to hold it. This is shaped perfectly for my hand. I just got lucky that the factory one did that. But if it wasn't for you, well, there's no reason why you couldn't remove a little bit of wood down on the horn to give you a little bit more extra space here or up here. If the center of your palm did not fit right on this one, which mine really doesn't, I should go in and lower it down. You can adjust that curvature. The only thing you just don't want to touch is the angle between the low spots right here, because that's your hang angle, and that affects the cutting teeth and the performance of the saw. In fact, if you go back and you watch that video where I built my two panel saws, you saw me pull up a board and shove Play-Doh on it, and I would squeeze it. I wanted to get the distance right here perfectly. Notice that this hump is a little bit lower on this one than it is on the carcass saw. That's because that's where it is on my palm, and that Play-Doh showed me that one. I do have a little bit extra material, just a little bit of use on this saw, I can tell, but better leave a little bit extra now, use it for a few projects, and then I can come back in with a knife or a rasp or anything like that to adjust it so that it fits me perfectly. Now, I know a lot of people are hesitant about really getting into a saw and modifying the handle because they think it's collectible or something like that. My opinion, you bought this in your career, and if you're buying something in your 20s or 30s, you're probably going to be using it for 60 years. And then you're going to be passing it along to a family member who very likely might have the same size hands as you. Why not modify it to get use out of it? I know they say these are collectible, but they made these by the millions. If somebody really wanted one, they could find one. So don't hesitate to modifying them if you need to. And given that attitude, if you want to make an entire new handle for a classic one and set aside the old one, that's perfectly fine too. I showed you all the steps needed in that last video where I made these two panel saws. But with that same idea, these sharp tooth saws from Stanley, they're actually pretty good. The teeth that they put on them are fairly nice. They're set a little bit of aggressive, but they're designed to do cross-cutting, and they will handle a little bit of ripping. You've seen me do that in past projects as example, as I've ripped 2x12s in half using a sharp tooth saw. The only thing that's really negative about them is the handles suck. So, if you're a woodworker, hey, why not take the time? Yes, you can modify them. You can modify them so that your fingers come in a little bit so they find a little notch right there. Just rasp off a little bit of wood right there and they'll fit perfectly. You can actually glue on wood if you want to, or if it's too small, take it off. You can adjust all those things, or just build a new handle and make it custom for you. That way you'll have a great panel saw perfectly fitted, and if you ever need to sharpen it, hey, just throw another $12, $15 blade on. And if you don't want to take the effort to build a whole handle for yourself, there are places out there that will make you a handle. Raising my hand here, keep your eyes out in my store, because occasionally I will do a batch run of handles specifically designed for the Stanley sharp tooth saws. And sometimes I will throw in some blades in there and just send you a whole new saw. Good handle, good steel, decent teeth. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a few things. This is the final video in my chapter on saws. The upcoming chapter will be all about planes, and we will go into as much detail there as we did with the saws in my introductory chapter 1 and 2. If you did enjoy this series, learned a few things, please do me a big favor. Like, favorite, subscribe, do all those social medias, and most importantly, pass this video series along to one of your friends or a fellow woodworkers. My hope is, when I'm done with these 12 chapters, it'll be like a video textbook that people can follow along and learn and end up with a really good understanding of some basic woodworking that they can do in their own little garage with really a minor set of tools. And in the end, I want you to remember one last thing, that it is always worth the effort to learn, create, and share with others. Y'all be safe and have fun.